it's I think of it like a normal distribution. Like there's like a segment of people who are going to be super prompt constructors. We're going to make some insane stuff.
Yeah.
But like most of the population is going to be in the middle, which is like they're just average. And then there's a good chunk of population which is like they don't care. They're never going to be good. They don't even want to try.
Well, at Khan Academy, we also had to shut down something because of scale.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the first podcast of the series. It's brought to you by FlowGPT. We're like the GitHub for prompts. And we have with us Pamela, Professor Pamela. She worked at Khan Academy and then came to UC Berkeley and taught the biggest class of CS. And I was a student then called CS 61A. And now she's doing amazing stuff with Microsoft that we were just talking about. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Should be fun.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, the larger topic around here is AI in education, but we'll dive deep into the specific things you definitely have a lot of experience with, especially Khan Academy and then UC Berkeley. And then FlowGPT has had an insane amount of users using ChatGPT for education and academic purposes.
Nice.
So that is amazing.
Yeah.
So the first thing, sort of like just getting into it, you mentioned before was, what are the most exciting use cases you've seen, especially in CS and ChatGPT or like AI in general in education?
Well, I mean, people are just starting to experiment with it from the professor, from the professor side, from the, I guess, the student side or the learner side. I think quite a few learners are figuring out how to use ChatGPT to teach themselves something new. That's what I hear about a lot is like, oh, I just used ChatGPT to teach me Rust. I used it, to teach me Bash. I use it to write all my Bash scripts now. So lots of people realizing that it can be just a good assistant for learning because you can get it to, say like, oh, dive deeper on this or zoom out on that, or let's explore this other thing. So lots of people experiment with that. And that's very cool. The dream is always, if you've read Neil Stephenson, The Diamond Age.
Yeah, I've not. But
okay, so there's in that book, there's something called the Young Girls Illustrated Primer, I think is what it's called. And it's this interactive book thing that helps this little girl face everything horrible in life and grow up. Like it figures out like what lessons to teach her right in time for her next thing.
Very personalized.
Very, very personalized. So like whenever like people who really want to do personalized education, we often talk about the illustrated primer because none of us has actually achieved it. Like when I first joined Khan Academy, we back then we would get a copy of Diamond Age.
Okay.
Because it's something that we would think to aspire to. And I would say like while I was at Khan Academy, we didn't figure it out, right? We realized like it's really hard to create content that, to create lots and lots of high quality content. It's hard to have multiple learning paths because of the like kind of prerequisites and dependencies, like, oh, this person needs to know X, Y, Z. And so having content that's exactly suited for that set of dependencies is really hard. So it's much easier logistically to take on everyone on to just go on that same path. But Khan Academy is now using an LLM. It's called Conmigo.
Okay.
I don't know if you've seen it, but they announced a few months ago. I chatted with them about it, and I think they're starting with using it for math, for people needing help with math problems. But I could see them using it for
multiple,
so many things. Yeah. So I think Khan Academy is actually really well suited to use it because Khan Academy has just a massive amount of past data that it could, if it needs to. Like, so a lot of times with LLMs, we talk about like, see what you can do with a prompt, right? First try your prompt, then try, first try zero shot, then try few shot, then try fine tuning.
Yeah.
And, your fine tuning is like your last.
Sort of like the most expensive, time consuming.
Yeah.
Might get the best results, but it's like.
Yeah, you do it when you need it. But that being said, like if Khan Academy wanted to do fine tuning, they would have so much data for doing it because there's, they've got the content, but also there's been like thousands, hundreds of thousands of questions and answers on that site.
Yes.
And I know because I used to subscribe to every notification.
Yeah.
A lot of them would be repetitive, but people they have a hard time searching for
And worldwide,
questions.
like Khan Academy's, I'm from Delhi and I watched all of my videos on Khan Academy.
That's right. And and they're localized. I don't know that the community is as big because I think India, they have multiple languages like Kannada.
I think so. Yeah. They're in India, they're like a lot of like.
Yeah. So I don't know how much Q&A they have, but Khan Academy both has the content and has the community that, pass questions. So I feel like they actually, because here's the thing about ChatGPT, which you all probably know this because you've been playing with it, but it can confabulate sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Whatever you want to call it. Yeah, whatever you want to call it. I hear some people don't like saying hallucination right now because it's like making it more human than it is. But so it can make stuff up because it's very creative.
Yeah.
But you don't want it to make stuff up when you're trying to get it to help you with a math problem or help you with your programming, right? You don't want it to make up some API function that doesn't exist because then you're trying to hit up this API and it's
not working.
Yeah. So I think that's actually where a lot of the effort is going to now is like how do you both take advantage of ChatGPT's creativity, but also rein it in so that it's answering with some amount of accuracy in that space. So at Azure at Microsoft, we have this sample that's been deployed like thousands of times now that is about ChatGPT on your data, and that's where you hook up, upload some data to a Azure Cognitive Search, which is a semantic search engine. And first, you ask ChatGPT a question, use the Da Vinci model to turn that into some keywords, pass those keywords into the semantic search, get back a bunch of chunks. And so you've already pre-chunked this to be like a couple paragraphs each, right? Because we've got a context window. So then you've got those chunks, and then you tell ChatGPT like, hey, answer this question in the context of this information.
Yeah. Very interesting.
So and you could cite the references too, right? And you tell ChatGPT to cite the references, and people are just really, really interested in that. And so you can imagine also using that in the educational situation where, I think ideally we would always try and get ChatGPT to cite its references, because right now you look at it and you're like, oh, I really want what you said to be true.
Well, I guess it's not. It's just like made up.
Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And you don't want to you don't want to have to doubt it. Yeah. So I think the more we can get it to provide citations,
it's going
to be really helpful. Yeah. So we're gonna need that for all use cases, whether it's search or EDU or whatever. But so I mean, I think it's really exciting that I think Khan Academy is pretty well equipped to be able to take advantage
of the education side.
Yeah.
So what's very interesting is that, I mean, you bring up context, and I think that's something that we've seen sort of like become very big, because if you put in a single line, ChatGPT has users from beginners to like advanced. Mm-hmm. And even if you give a little context saying that I'm very technical and make this as technical as possible, GPT will get into depth.
Right.
So context is like, I believe like a big thing, which is going to be like the next thing. So you bring up like Khan Academy, and you bring up like data or like the private data they have. So when you look at, let's say, colleges like UC Berkeley, like for example, CS61A.
Yeah.
So I mean, you taught that course. It's been here for like decades.
Yeah.
How do you see ChatGPT, or like how do you see Berkeley courses, CS courses, or any courses, for example, 61A, using ChatGPT in like teaching that?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's two sides to this. So we should like describe CS61A for the folks that haven't taken it. So it is we call it like a CS 1.5 class because it's pretty hard for an intro class. So usually people have done some programming before, some amount of programming, because it is really difficult because we really get into the weeds. So we do Python, we do Scheme, we do sometimes SQL, we do a few things. And we really get into it. In the final project, you're writing a Scheme compiler using Python. And the assignments along the way are actually like, they're pretty difficult. Yeah, they're pretty difficult. Both from a Python perspective, we use quite a few parts syntactically of Python, but also from an algorithmic perspective.
Yeah.
Like you're having to figure out like how to do tree recursion on, this funky problem. So it's really like bending your mind in a lot of ways, which is cool, but it's hard. So the interesting thing here, so when we think about ChatGPT, my first thought is like, oh my God, everybody's going to use ChatGPT to write their code, right? Or to use GitHub Copilot, right? So
something, any of the
any LLM, yeah. And it's probably going to do it just fine because there's all these answers. They're 618 students shouldn't listen to this, but they're all online, right?
Everything.
We know that because that was how we checked to see, like, did you copy this? We checked to see.
But that was like plagiarism detection thing that if you copy pasted code, but now GPT can sort of.
Yeah, now GPT might change it in subtle ways. So it's like, hopefully, like, the current 61A staff has figured out different approaches, but it definitely, for a professor, if there's concerns about academic integrity, about misconduct and cheating and all that, it's definitely worrisome with our kind of problem, like the kinds we did for labs and homeworks, because we would typically reuse very similar problems year after year with small tweaks. If you really wanted to, you could find the answer online, and we would discourage that, obviously, because we want you to, try and figure it out yourself. So that's really interesting. So my immediate thought is like, oh my gosh, we can't use the same problems every year. But then how do you have a consistent learning experience, a consistent level of rigor? It's really hard. It's hard to invent new problems all the time. So, but one possibility is, I've seen this mentioned, the idea of using ChatGPT to help you come up with new problems. Because at Khan Academy, like, I wrote hundreds and hundreds of questions for the AP CSP course that we have on there. And it was so hard to come up with that many questions. I would just be like going for walks and like looking in random books at the library to try to get ideas for a new question, because there were just so many. We just had to make so many. So, one idea is like, okay, maybe ChatGPT can help you with the questions, but other ideas are like, can you just flip this on his head, right? So can you use ChatGPT in different ways? Can you tell your students like, okay, ask GPT, to solve this problem, but then you have to explain the code that it writes.
Okay.
Right. So being able, like, this is actually going to be a huge, a huge skill that everybody needs, is being able to understand code that's been written, whether it's been written on Stack Overflow or by your colleague or by an LLM. You need to understand that. Now, granted, ChatGPT, like GitHub Copilot, can explain that, right? So you want to like put that in your own words. So professors can figure out how to flip it on its head.
It's intense.
It's hard. It's hard to think about that. But my dream was always, and I never for 61A got to redo the projects, but I always wanted the projects to have a greater degree of creativity in them. So to still have the constraints where, like, okay, you're learning object-oriented programming, you're using classes and inheritance and stuff like that. But you're creating your own twist on some sort of game, right? So that would be really nice to be able to give students more creativity. And one thing I do like about ChatGPT, so let's put aside the academic misconduct thing. That's hard. And honestly, like, at some point, everyone, like, if somebody really wants to cheat,
figure it out.
They're gonna, So ideally, we would just live in a world where grades were not so important, and
learning is more.
Right. So if students are in it for the learning, so then it's more about like, okay, how can ChatGPT help there? So one thing that's interesting is trying to get ChatGPT's help in evaluating students' projects. Because for 61A, we had between 1,000 and 2,000 students.
Wow.
And so it was really, really hard to be able to grade
so many. So you have to be like
we had to use those automated tests, right? We did do something called composition. I don't know if you were in a semester where we did composition. Composition was where we would have tutors look at the code quality and make comments about the code quality after passing in the project. And there would just be a couple points per composition on every project. So that's like giving feedback on code style, because we can use these automated tests to say it passed, it didn't pass. But then, it's very possible to write your code in such a convoluted
style
way.
is bad.
Yeah, style is bad. It's inefficient. Maybe you're using like four nested for loops
or
instead
like
of
helper functions you just don't need.
Yeah,
Anything,
exactly.
anything,
Yeah. So all of that stuff. So I think one thing that's interesting is that we could potentially use an LLM to help with scaling up project evaluation. That to me seems pretty exciting. So project evaluation, both in terms of being able to comment on style or saying like this code looks overly complex, all those sorts of things.
It can be simplified or something.
Can be simplified, right? Like I can imagine, telling the LLM like, here's what the ideal code looks like, or here's a couple of examples of what the ideal code looks like. Make some comments on this. I haven't tried this particular test. I haven't attempted this yet to see how well it would do with giving style feedback.
Okay.
And it would be interesting to see if it would, help to do some few shot prompting or, fine tuning based on GitHub reviews or something. I don't know.
Something.
Or even past, like we do have lots of past data for this particular thing. So if you have past data, fine tuning is always a chance. But because composition was something we actually had to shut down eventually. So you might have been in a semester where we didn't have it because we didn't have the scale to do it.
The right quality or like?
We just it was just hard. It just took a huge number of hours. It took so many hours and we couldn't have consistent quality. So both too many hours and inconsistent quality, right? So we just had to just stop doing it when I was there. But this is something that an LLM can help with scale. Because if it's something like if you've got a 20-person class and you can give feedback to each person, awesome. But Berkeley, we had 2,000 people. Khan Academy, we had like hundreds of thousands, right?
Tech, you're just like going global.
Yeah. So like imagine at Khan Academy. So Khan Academy, another thing at Khan Academy, we also had to shut down something because of scale. So Khan Academy for the Intro to JS curriculum, which at this point, hundreds of thousands of people have been through it. It's got coding challenges, which are graded automatically with tests, but then it also has coding projects. And the projects were originally graded with this whole peer evaluation system where first you would do a self-evaluation according to a rubric, and you would check off and say, meets this rubric, meets this rubric, meets this rubric. And then you would set it off for a peer evaluation, and it would find a peer that had already done that project and ask them to do it. So this was great when it worked, but we just never quite got to the scale. And we would have I personally did hundreds and hundreds of evaluations. Our community members would have to make up for it.
Some of them would do a lot, we
just didn't have enough people, right? And I've experimented with sending this to ChatGPT and saying, so I tell ChatGPT, here's the rubric, here's the student code, please evaluate this rubric, evaluate this code according to the rubric, and it'll respond back and just say, yes, yes, no, no, yes. So it totally would work for this case.
Very interesting.
I don't know, I didn't test on the accuracy of it, and that was just doing few shot prompting. So I sent in 3 examples, here's one that passed all the rubrics, here's one that failed all the rubrics. So I think this would be a good example for doing fine tuning.
Fine tuning is the next step, right? If this is working, then you're we want to improve the accuracy.
Or if it's not working, right? It did seem to, it seemed to be able to do some basic evaluations, but couldn't do more complex evaluations where the code was off in a less obvious way.
Or to just create something absolutely new.
If someone did something very, very different, right? Which is okay, because this example is something once again, this project of peer evaluation, we eventually had to just shut it down on Khan Academy because we couldn't scale it. So this is a situation where we couldn't use humans, right? Ideally, we don't want to put all humans out of business, right?
Yeah.
What humans can do, when humans can do it, that's friggin' awesome.
Yeah.
But if they can't, we don't have the scale to help every single person who wants feedback on their code, on a free coding website. So so that's something where it could be really compelling to use it for doing automated, evaluation of creative projects at scale.
Very interesting. So that brings me to the next question, or sort of the fundamental question that people have now. That would coding be a thing in next 10 years or next 5 years? If I am a class of 2035 coming to Berkeley, would I be taking a class teaching me how to interact with an LLM that codes great, or would I still be learning the basics of coding?
It's a great question. I think that, like Copilot and them, they do really well currently in repetitive scenarios, scenarios that have already happened. And there's quite a few of those. Like when we're making a web app and we're following a standard CRUD architecture, MVC architecture, things tend to look the same. But then as soon as you're doing something different, it's not going to do that well.
It's not trained on that data.
You're doing something unexpected, right? So, these LLMs do really well when you're doing something predictable. And fortunately, lots of programming is predictable. And that's why it can feel really nice to use Copilot, because it's like, it doesn't excite me to write this repetitive code, right? But then, you suddenly get to something that's new. And also this new thing is probably going to be a bit trickier, right? And this is where this is when programming gets hard, is when you do the edge cases, right? 90%, once you're used to programming, like 90% of it is just whatever. But then as soon as you get to the interesting bits, the edge cases, I think LLMs can probably help us with getting unstuck with, just like a pair programmer can help you look at it, even if it gives you a bad idea, it might
give you something.
Give you something, right?
You still need to know.
But you still need to know. So I don't know, maybe this is, because I'm, previous generation and still, want programming to be a thing, but I think we'll still be programming. I think we'll be using the heavy use of tools to reduce repetitive code. But if we don't know how to code at all, I think we're going to struggle with the edge cases. And we have not yet figured out how to rid the world of edge cases.
The edge cases. Because they've existed for
the world is complicated. You can't if you wanted to, you could remake the world so that it had no edge cases and everything just, worked really well and you didn't have to have these weird if statements everywhere. But so far the world's pretty hairy. So I think we need programming for those hairy bits.
Very interesting. Very interesting. But so I was talking to someone else and they were explaining to me programming in LLMs and what their view is and how it evolves. And it resonates to me a little bit. So I would love to know your opinion on it. It's if you look at the macro, the large extent, a lot of it is you're doing the very basic things in coding, the repetitive tasks you're talking about. And then there's that 5-10%, which is super genius, where you're spending probably 80% of your time doing that. Most of the things that are repetitive are getting outsourced to South Asian countries, or where it's cheaper to do those things. A new opinion that is coming out is that coding is going to be a thing, but it's not going to be a thing as big as it is right now, where everyone is trying to become a software engineer. And every software engineering job is not about solving those edge cases. Some of it is just repeating stuff, which will be taken over by LLMs.
Interesting. I guess I'd be surprised if a particular LLM could take over the entire an entire code base, because I tend to think that every code base has edge cases.
Sure.
So, you could have an LLM try to write an entire code base, but then you'd probably have to go in there and you have to spend some amount of time understanding the code, wrapping your head around it. So I guess I would wonder, wouldn't it have been better if it was a programmer assisted by an LLM the whole time, because once you have to understand that code, it's hard to understand anyone else's code, right?
Sure.
So my hope would be to continue using the LLMs more as pair programmers than as considering standalone programmers. I feel that most programs have edge cases. Most programs have interesting parts. Even a simple WordPress site, I've run into edge cases while working on them. Right?
Very interesting.
So you could maybe there will be a model where there's people who just rush in, and so that's another reason for being getting really skilled at reading code.
Yeah.
If that is what happens, then all of us are going to have to be really skilled at diving into an LLM's code base and, fixing whatever isn't quite working. And then, that could become a model.
So is this going to be a reskilling thing? Okay, let's say even if it's pair programming, right? and it's like I'm getting some of my tasks done with an LLM, and then I'm spending the rest, well, 80% of my time solving those edge cases or those complex problems, or like understanding the LLM's code. If I'm using an LLM, I'm probably prompting on that LLM, whether it's fine-tuned or whether it's like, well, GPT 7, 8, whatever. How do you think that reskilling would take place? Like, would like colleges start incorporating that in their curriculums, or like, is that something that?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I did actually just put out a video on the VizCode channel about prompting with Copilot. Yeah. So, so I've done various experiments to figure out like how to get Copilot to respond the best and the most accurate. And my takeaway is that most of the practices are just generally good practices. So for example, the way I summarized it was you want to provide context and be predictable, right? So providing context is something like writing a good function name, writing a good function comment, documenting your function, using types, and if it's like a type optional language. So those are all things that are going to give Copilot a ton of context, but also will give context to anyone else reading your code, to linters. Like it's just generally improving your code better quality, practice. Right? So, using better variable names, all these things that can make it easier for the LLM generally improves your code quality. The one thing that doesn't is perhaps the huge amount of comments you could end up writing. So I do usually often like go through and delete my comments to Copilot afterwards. But everything else, like writing your code in a well-structured way so that, all the models are in models.py and all the views are in views.py, having that kind of structure, it's going to help out the LLM. It's going to help out anyone future colleagues. Yeah. So, I mean, my hope would be that, and this was something actually in 61A, like I got so mad when I first joined 61A because the variable names and the function names drove me crazy because we would have these functions named like AA. And I'm like, why are we teaching them? Yeah. Why? Like, this is not good code. We had so many examples of code that just made me like, because, and I knew why we were doing it. We were doing it because if you could understand that code, you could understand anything. So I both got why we were doing that, but I got worried when I saw that, like, oh, we're teaching people to write this code. And I would later see code that came out from students who were in 61A, and they continued on some of the bad practices that we accidentally introduced. So this is what I would say is that if you are teaching programming, teach good, clean, I guess clear code from the beginning. I mean, you don't need to like sacrifice performance. Like sometimes there's a debate about clean code versus performance. So you don't need to sacrifice performance, but you can very often write code in a way that's better, like well organized, does things in the idiomatic way of the language, and is as clear to read. So please, everyone, just do that now because it's good. It's just good for everyone. Keep it clean. Keep it clean.
That's wonderful. So that brings me to my next question that I'm very interested in understanding. That is, let's say, there are tools and everyone has sort of like learned prompting, or everyone has learned that, okay, prompting is a thing. The way I interact with the world is changing. I used to, like 40 years before, if I wanted to build something, it was complex. It was writing machine level, whatever. And then Python came in and made it easier. And then more tools came in, which made it easier. And sort of like LLM is like the next step, right? And you talked about fine-tuning LLMs. So let's say I'm writing code and then there's an LLM which is good at writing code. Now there might be an LLM which is great at doing math or like fine-tune to do math. And there might be an LLM which might be fine-tuned to do something else. So do you think that that's going to be a thing, that there are going to be different models for different specific things? Or do you think there's going to be just one model, like GPT-10, which is going to be capable of doing basically 90% of the tasks that you and I would need in daily life?
That's interesting. I mean, that I would say I'm not an LLM. I'm an expert, nor do I even have a lot of training in ML. So I think that would be a good question for somebody like Andre Karpathy. I'd love to hear his response. So yeah, I think, I've read people talk about how, it seems like the current LLMs, they're very, very good at code. Like code seems to work really well for LLMs because code is predictable.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
Because our languages, follow good syntax. And also, LLMs are good at grammar, at language grammar. So code has grammar, languages have grammar, and these LLMs have been fed enough so that they've learned the grammar. So they just don't make grammatical mistakes. I've never seen a grammatical mistake come out of GPT-4. And so that shocked me because I was a linguistics minor. And so I've been saying this whole time, like, no, you can, like, ML will never be able to, get, even with brute force and n-grams, like it's never going to get perfect grammar, but I'm wrong. So, so they're very good at things that have rules, that have grammars. And then, and the vocabulary is like embedded in this space. So I guess the question is like, if you for math, does it help it? Is the structure different enough, or is like the vector embedding space different enough that it helps it to train it sort of that? So maybe like I was actually explaining to my partner this morning because we were having this debate as soon as we wake up in the morning and start talking about GPTs. Because I used ChatGPT to get ideas for what to make my 4-year-old for lunch.
Okay.
And I said, this is a great use of ChatGPT.
Yeah.
He's like, what? But ChatGPT doesn't know anything. And I was like, well, what do you mean by no? What is no? And he's like, well, it's just predicting the next word. But I was like, okay, but it's doing it based off of this embedding space.
Yeah.
So ChatGPT does have some sort of knowledge that cat and dog are similar semantically, right?
Sure.
So it has like the ontology of the world coded up, or at least the ontology of the written world.
Yeah.
And the coded world is, encoded in this vector space.
Okay.
Right? So that is some form of knowledge.
Okay.
Granted, I think humans have additional knowledge and we have like maybe multiple embedding spaces. So for example, when I was in college, I actually did research in trying to teach a computer spatial prepositions.
Okay.
So spatial prepositions is like over, around, under, that sort of thing. And so the first thing I did was that I researched how cultures across the world had spatial prepositions to try and figure out like what is in our head that we're encoding when we're trying to figure it out. Because some cultures will have like in front of the mountain, behind the mountain, north, south, like all these different ways. So I ended up making 3D scenes and then feeding angles into the machine learning algorithm. And so it would learn prepositions based off of the angles of things in the scenes. But this was first based off doing like a cultural analysis. But so that's something where like, that might be the kind of knowledge that humans have, where like in addition to some encoding of like similarities between words, we also have like a spatial knowledge of how the world works, right? And lines and angles and stuff like this. So yeah, I don't know. So it is I think it's an interesting question about whether the LLMs are going to be fine-tuned for different cases, or if it's just a matter of throwing more at it. And I've seen debates about that, and I'm not an expert at all, but
it's like TBD in the future.
Yeah, I think it'll be pretty interesting to see to see what happens, and maybe we'll learn that human brains are either way fancier than we thought or not.
Yeah. That's definitely something that sort of like everyone is trying to answer that question. I mean, at Flow, what we're focused on is, or like what we're betting on is that eventually there are going to be multiple models. I don't know if it's going to be thousands, maybe it's like a couple hundred good models, which are going to be very specific for specific things. And a lot of consumers will sort of like, or like a lot of prompters will pick their models over time. They'll be like, I feel more comfortable doing most of my tasks on GPT-4 for coding related, and anything that is language related, I like Google. And we're like, okay, when you're doing that, you're going to have a lot of prompts that you're going to be making on a daily basis. A lot of tasks are going to be repeated. What if you could have like a repository to manage all of that?
Yeah.
Do you see, like, let's say 2 years down the line, when a lot of the tasks you're doing in daily life, like you give the example of like cooking a meal and you prompted that.
Yeah.
You could probably use Instacart plugin on GPT-4 to order it.
Yeah.
Like order the specific ingredients. So do you see yourself like managing a lot of prompts in learning purposes and education purposes, or like in general?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think maybe like as this, like maybe the super users be managing prompts. I think, in computers, we always do abstraction, right? Like once we realize that there's potential for another level of abstraction, we find ways to add it on, right? So I was talking about how we have this popular sample that does ChatGPT on your data, and it uses actually DaVinci and then ChatGPT and all this stuff. But Azure is actually just going to go ahead and bake that into ChatGPT. So it's already actually the case that you can call the ChatGPT API and just specify a data source that's a cognitive search index.
Okay.
And it knows to do it on the data.
Okay.
So that's like a super specific, like it's super specific and also very popular use case, which is search on this data, right? So I think like probably like we'll be accumulating like lots of prompts like you have on your site. But also figuring out like which of these should there be a higher level of abstraction for? If everybody's trying to get ChatGPT to search on their data, should we just be, making a library for that, a package, something, right? Because otherwise what you have is everyone's trying to figure out, how do I get it to like, cite my data the best? And how do I get it to like, I saw this discussion today, like, how do I get it to really stick to my data and not go outside? This is actually the biggest problem I've seen with ChatGPT. It's very generous.
Yeah.
It wants to give you as much information as possible. And you really have to like, no, you're good. Right. And so we don't want we don't need everybody to solve this problem. Like somebody needs to figure this out. And then, somehow either becomes a canonical prompt or like canonical sample, or there's a library for it. So yeah, I think these things there'll be higher level of abstractions for the things that become more frequently needed.
Interesting. So, I mean, the thing is, it'll get easier for users to get the same result when you say abstraction. It's like easier to get the same output.
Yeah, like if a user wants to do something, they shouldn't have to become a prompt engineer.
Sure.
So you've got like these super users that are figuring it out, but most users aren't prompt engineers. Maybe we'll all learn prompt engineering at some point, but similar with programming, like not everybody's a programmer yet, right? So that's why we have like no code tools and low code tools and that sort of stuff. So think about like low prompt and no prompt tools.
And so I think of it like a normal distribution. Like there's like a segment of people who are going to be super prompt constructors. We're going to make some insane stuff.
Yeah.
But like most of the population is going to be in the middle, which is like they're just average. And then there's a good chunk of population, which is like they don't care. They're never going to be good. They don't even want to try.
Well, like I think the hope is that because the crappy thing would be is that if we come up with this technology and once again, the technology only benefits like, the 1%, right? That'd be really crappy, right? Yes. So that's what I would say, like, I would encourage us to figure out like, how do we bring powerful tools to people in the middle, right? So like example, like ChatGPT can write very fluent English.
Yes.
And right now that can be a blocker for people like getting jobs. Like they can't write like a English fluent cover letter, even though they're actually like amazing at their job, right? So how can we if we can bring that, to folks who need it, like that would be amazing. So I would hope that for that middle, if we could find ways to bring these powerful tools, for everyone in the middle is probably going to be via some sort of user interface, either, web or SMS or is built into Microsoft Word or whatever. And then we'll still have the super prompters and they'll be, figuring out what the next
thing. I think it's like the way you brought up, it's going to be like, there's a model, maybe fine tuned, maybe not, like just a model. There's a prompt and then there's a UI.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're trying to do is we're trying to solve like that prompting problem.
Mm-hmm.
So you brought up like cover letter, and that's sort of like something we've seen a lot of use cases on.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are coming on and making resumes, cover letter prompts and stuff like that for like specific industry, like CS or like finance. And now a normal user can just come in, pick up something which is already there. Like this person has spent the time, the expertise to build a high quality prompt, which gives out a high quality result. And now the user can literally just put in the information that is asked.
Yeah.
in a UI template format, and they get the result. I think that is sort of like very ideal.
Yeah, I even like started writing that app, right? Where
Yeah.
I was like, I was actually doing it specifically for recommendation letters because
Okay.
when I was at Berkeley, you know, I had 2,000 students.
Yeah.
A lot of students ask for recommendation letters. I can't write
You cannot write.
2,000 words.
Not hard.
And it, you know, I would just get writing block too. So
Yeah.
I would actually use a GPT to help me get over that
Wow.
writing block.
How, like, tell me what would you do? Like, if you were like writing recommendations, how would you be?
Oh, well, I mean, I did use it. So I would say, you know, here's the student, these are their particular skills. This is how they did in the class. And they're applying to a master's program.
Okay.
And then it would write the letter. And they got in. So I think it worked.
Works out. You could actually just go on FlowGPT and create a template for that.
Oh, really? Okay.
So you'd create a prompt describing all of those things.
Yeah.
And every time someone wants a recommendation from you, either you can just send them on your page on FlowGPT, or you can just open Flow up. You can put in the specific things like probably the resume, probably the stuff that they've done in class, or probably which university they want to go, like in an input field, and it'll spin out the recommendation.
Nice.
What that does is it saves you time. Instead of writing it again and again and again, same prompt, you already have a template.
Yeah.
So that's like a very, very simple format of a use case we saw.
Yeah.
A lot of people using it for.
And can you even like upload PDFs and stuff like that?
Coming soon.
Okay.
So PDFs like context.
Yeah.
PDFs, URLs. That's. I mean, basically, I was watching your video like literally yesterday on like context and GoPilot, and I was like, that is so spot on.
Yeah.
Like you have to give it context to these like quality results.
Yeah. So and if you can make it easy to bring in their resume, then that's like really nice, right? Because then you don't, because most people aren't gonna figure out how to copy and paste a resume nicely into ChatGPT. But you can wrap on top of that. You can use PDF extraction services. At Azure, we have like form recognizer. So you can make it easy to extract that data and and put it in there. So yes, that's really nice.
Yeah. Wonderful. So I know you mentioned before about on the email you were like, we should definitely talk about the security use cases of AI, or like and we touched upon a little bit in terms of like cheating and plagiarism.
Yeah.
What do you think are like the bigger risks that AI brings in education?
Okay. Well, I'll say instead of AI, I like to say LLM or GPT because when I was a kid, AI was very different. So I like to be specific and call it what it is, because we still don't really know what intelligence is.
Okay.
But we know what LLMs are. So there's a lot of apprehension around LLMs in education because, of course, the how much easier it is to construct something. Like LLMs are actually really good at writing. They're very good at writing. And even if it's it's something slightly novel. So what I've seen is lots of teachers. I'm no longer teaching this year, at least not in the university context. But I have seen lots of teachers, commenting about how they're using it, and lots of folks are doing stuff like having their students critique what comes out of ChatGPT. Now, I guess the interesting thing is, can you get ChatGPT to critique itself and avoid doing that job? Yeah, maybe, yeah. But this is like bringing on another skill set. And that is something like we generally all at this point have to do because of the fact that a lot of these LLMs are not providing citations. And at any point on the web, the web is going to become just a mess, right? Sure. So at any point on the web, we don't know what we're looking at, whether it was actually written by like
LLMs.
An LLM, a human expert, or a human who didn't know what they're doing, right? We have a range. We have human experts, humans that are kind of making stuff up too, and LLMs. So, how do you know, like when you look for medical advice, how do you know what you're looking at? Is
it a verified source or not? That's like probably going to be very important.
Yeah. So how do we think critically about that? And I have seen people, even NPR last week did an article about how to spot like Dolly generated imagery. Like if you look at an image, how do you know that it's been
I mean, with I feel like with like emails, sometimes I get like a lot of these emails. No, not even phishing emails, like people just reaching out for jobs or partnerships or something. And you can just tell by the structure that this email is written by GPT.
Yeah.
But like if you play with the prompt a little bit, it's really difficult to identify like, is it coming from an LM or is it coming from like a human or like both? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and how much does it actually matter? I mean, people have been sending form emails for quite a long time now. So that's the other question, right? So when we become suspicious of everything on the web, that also, I think that's also why we're starting to see a move towards smaller communities where maybe there's a higher level of trust. Because you might think like, oh, in a random subreddit, maybe things are generated by bots. But perhaps like, just on a Mastodon community, like you assume that people are writing their own toots, as they're called. So yeah, we might see a move towards smaller communities due to just a higher level of distrust with the web.
In general, like just apart from models and
just in general, especially like with everything happening with like Twitter and Reddit and all this stuff. So I think we're at like a really interesting point. So I've kind of gone off tangent here, but we're at a pretty interesting point in the web right now where, we for a long time it seemed like Twitter would be forever, right? Yeah. But now it's not clear that Twitter is going to be forever. Right. Like Twitter seems to be kind of sinking and forking into different sites. Reddit right now seems like maybe it might be. Well, we see, like, we don't know what's going to be a year from now. Like, are we going to have Reddit? Are we going to have Twitter? But for a lot of us, like, for the last few years, it felt like they would both be forever. But of course, we always forget that forever always ends. There's
nothing like too big to fail. Like
which is really interesting because for those of us, like I've been on Twitter since like 2009 or something, like since the beginning. So it's weird to walk away from it, but then that's how these things happen. So where I'm seeing is a move, I moved to Mastodon. Mastodon is a much smaller community, but it's actually great. It's awesome. It scratches the itch. It doesn't have to be a huge community for me feeling like I can shout into the ether and somebody responds. All I wanted. So that's really interesting. Okay, but what we were talking about was LLMs and the risk for education. So if we have to worry about academic misconduct and all that stuff, then that's obviously a big thing.
It's like I think the pros that LLMs bring, it's especially like the hyper personalized education. That is sort of like, yes, there's going to be plagiarism, but I use it as a tool to like learn a lot of things that I did not learn before. And I think even in analogies. So right now, if you're teaching, let's say, any topic, like let's say economics, and you're teaching that to someone in Indonesia, a lot of the analogies you're giving are like very American because like economics was like or econ was like a very American thing, like teams and all. But now the LLM can understand that person, where they come from, and make it more personalized. And that's sort of something that you were trying to do at Khan Academy as well, I assume. So how much do you think models will be useful in that context?
Yeah, that's really nice because the models have been trained on a very large geographically wide corpus. They do have a bias towards English US, right? We definitely have to keep that bias in mind because it pops up all the time. I've done lots of tests with Copilot to verify this because when you ask for fake data, it's going to be one Main Street US and it's going to be Joe Smith. Like that's what happens, right? So they definitely have a bias. But here's the interesting thing is that you can get them, they know that they have, like you can, if you tell them like, like one thing I do with Copilot chat all the time, because I've had chat for the last few months, is I tell it, you can do /fix and you tell it to fix an area of code and I can just say, make it more inclusive.
Okay.
And if I tell it to make it more inclusive, even though it wrote the original code, right? Like say you're making a web form and your form has genders, majors, languages, that sort of thing. When you first write it, it's, it's going to have, like male, female, and then the majors are going to be like computer science and econ.
Yeah.
Right? And then I tell it to make it more inclusive. Like, okay, then it's going to add, non-binary, other. It's going to add all this stuff. It's going to add way more majors. We've got our history, all this stuff. So even though it wrote the original code, it also knows how to make it more inclusive.
Interesting.
So like that's something to keep in mind, is that the LLMs right now is trying to give you what it thinks you want.
Okay.
But it has the ability to go outside there. So if you want it to give you something that's not US based, then you can try to do that. But you have to be really specific. Say like, what I'm looking for is something that's more, geographically inclusive, or I want an example from India or something like that, right? So I think that has a lot of potential. Most people aren't going to realize how much they can. How much they can be.
You think there's more like unlocked potential like models than people like realize?
Yeah, because they realize like models are trying to please us, and they think that we want what everybody else wants.
Okay.
But if we're different, we want something else. Then you would just have to tell it that. Like
context is going to be like, I'm assuming like big important thing.
Yeah, like even like when you're doing a form, if you write the little comment and says make an accessible form.
Yeah.
That's going to change the output. Like Copilot is unfortunately not writing accessible forms by default. It's not including all the things you need to make a fully accessible website. But if you tell it to make it accessible, it will.
It will.
And I have given feedback to the Copilot team about like all these things, like, because it'd be really great if it just, I think that'd be an interesting thing, is like how much like knowledge do we bring into these tools, and how much best practices do we bring into tools, right? Like right now, it's doing what it's seen the most often.
Sure.
Even if that's not the best practice. Like what you see the most often is inaccessible, non-inclusive things.
Yeah.
So that's what it gives you. But you can get it to give you this other stuff. So I think an interesting question is, could that go into the prompt? Right? If we can agree on best practices, would it make sense to get something like Copilot to always be producing those and to give it more knowledge? So for example, if you're developing in Python, the way you declare your packages is in requirements.txt, or like JavaScript is like package.json. Sure. So right now, in theory, Copilot could just make up a package name.
Yeah.
And some people have talked about like that's a good way to, like, that's a security risk, because you could package squat, you could figure out what Copilot's writing, and then write up put that package on the package index. So it would be better to say like, okay, let's make sure that when an LLM is in requirements.txt, it like constrains itself. Okay. I think that to me is an interesting question, is like, how many constraints do we try to bring into these tools
to shape it into like a particular direction?
Because on the one, because it would mean like, oh, like what if you intended to write a never before packaged name, because you're literally creating that package right now in another folder, right? I mean, in that case, you maybe just type it yourself. You can, but yeah. So I generally think that's interesting thing is to figure out how to rate it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much potential and unexplored things, because we come to Flow and see so many amazing use cases people are figuring out, which is GPT-4.
Yeah,
and I'm like, that is insane. Like 2 years down the line, when every company is in this, and like there's more models coming out, getting better, and more people are getting into this, like the use cases you'll have is just like great, and that is something definitely very exciting.
Yeah, and so on Flow, are people using it to help them like debug their code? Like what coding things have you used?
Yes, coding things, a lot of it. So I think it's mostly like divided into three things. So one is people building prompts to teach themselves how to code. So if they want to learn about something specific, they'll be like, okay, can you teach me this, or can you build a course for me? Okay. So build me a Python course, like a SQL course, or like a data structures course. And they'll go deep into like Q&A and all that stuff.
Wow.
Second thing is definitely debugging. Like I'll give you a code and then you debug this. So I saw this one template that someone created, this one debugging template, and you can just upload your code and it'll just like spit out the debug. And that is very interesting. Third thing that I saw, which is it'll guide you in building a project.
Oh, okay.
So you make a template describing and giving all the context about the project, like what you want to do. And then as ChatGPT does, it'll give you a structure of this is what you need to get. and this is how you go about doing those things. So that is, I think, very interesting.
Okay, yeah. So because I was wondering, because there is one use case that I was experimenting with, was the helping debug, right?
Okay.
So, we give people a Python problem, we give them some doc tests, to say what the input output should be. And then when it doesn't work, that's a lot of times when we get questions like, my code doesn't work. And the issue is that a lot of people have a hard time understanding error messages, right? And they don't know like what line of code to even start looking at. So I was trying to prompt GPT. I was trying to prompt GPT to get it to give them the kind of hint a TA would give, right? Because a TA would come to you and say, look at the code. And then a TA often would actually like ask you a question, right? Socratic wise, like trying not to give you the answer. And it's interesting because I struggled to get, so ChatGPT is very happy to write the code for me.
Like rewrite it and tell you like this is.
So ChatGPT was like very, very happy to be like, this is what's wrong and here's the right way to do it. But what I struggled to do was to get ChatGPT to stop writing the solution.
Okay.
And instead be a little more Socratic about it, right? And so I think that's interesting. I don't know if anyone has, come up with a good prompt around that, but that was something that's like trying to bring ChatGPT in to only give like a one-line helper.
Just like, or like walk me through, or become like a TA.
Yeah.
Act as a TA.
Right. And not give the whole solution.
Yeah. I think it's definitely doable, with prompting. I'm not sure if like it is already done on Flow, but I'll be happy to spend some time, build it and send it to you.
Yeah. I think if you figure it out, anyone figure out, I think that would be really helpful, because that's the thing is like when students, if they're really trying to learn, they don't need the solution.
Yeah.
They need the next step
a
to the
little
solution.
hint, just a little hint.
Yeah, just one line hint. And
that's a great resource for learning anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, I know. I think almost exactly at time. So thank you so much for coming here and taking our time.
Yeah.
Love the conversation. A lot of great insights. And thank you everyone for watching this. And if you have any questions, I'll link in the email in the description. So if you have any questions, reach out to us. And appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.